we are ready. I don't want to disperse people. I know that it's late in the evening and people are a little bit tired already. I promise I will try to engage you in many different ways. So, and especially because we have the challenge that we are late in the evening. So I'm gonna encourage everyone to go to this website. I'm gonna be trying to do exercises with you. I always work with youth, with Indigenous youth, and I think it's really important to engage in a two-way conversation. So I know that it's a little bit challenging because we are a lot of people in this room, but if you go here, I think we are going to be able to have a more engaging conversation. I already see 5 people that are in. So I always encourage youth, if you see someone that is not getting access, support each other. So if you see anyone having trouble to get in, just please help your colleagues, please. Is everyone in? I need to put the slides. Okay? Okay. So, well, as I said, technology is always a challenge. I don't see the slides. Okay. One sec. Luke. Where's Luke? Oh, it's not here. Just the slides, please. Sorry about that. I'm not sure.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
He can't find his slides.
Oh.
There we go.
Oh, yeah.
There you go.
Thank you. Yeah, this is good. Thank you so much for the support. Okay, thank you. Ani, Tlen, hola. Akinkin Wanikan Alejandro. Today, I feel grateful to be here. I recognize that we are in the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Mississauga Credit First Nation. And I think I really enjoy what Jonathan mentioned before. It's not just about acknowledgement. It's not just about checking the checkbox at the beginning of every conference. I think there should be a commitment. So my commitment today is to recognize that all the work that I'm going to be sharing with you today is not just my work. It's the work from community, a lot of knowledge keepers, a lot of elders from Toronto. And I think it's really important to recognize this work. And I hope you enjoy. It has been a long journey and a lot of learning in that journey. In your devices now, you can give me a little bit of feedback. If you go to Pulse, that is the last tab, you can give me a little bit of feedback how you are feeling. Even if you are feeling bored, that will help me a lot to see how much should I spend. I do this for life, so I can spend like the entire day just talking about this. So if you feel that this is exciting, please provide me feedback. This will help me to deliver the session. So the first thing that I'm going to ask you, to everyone here, is to answer the poll that is in your phones. Okay. So with that feedback, I see that 77% in this room hasn't worked with Indigenous peoples, while 23% is working with Indigenous people. So basically, 1 person of 4 have been working with Indigenous people. So with that in mind, I would like to move to this important topic, and especially about what is going on in Canada. One very important part that I really enjoy about the other sessions that I had the opportunity to be in, I was eager to talk about of all the things that we have been doing. But something that I learned from the elders is first, before you share, you need to listen. And believe me, in the digital space, this has been missing for a long period of time. We haven't listened. And especially from the government perspective, we haven't listened to our First Nations, to the Métis communities and the Inuit communities. We haven't listened. So I always like storytelling. So this journey that I'm gonna be sharing with you today, it has been a journey of 6 years. 6 years of being in community. I'm originally from the tip of the tail of Turtle Island, and I always said that we are here, and in my case, and especially with the communities that I have been working with as a guest, and as a guest, I have responsibilities too. So in this journey and in this community, what we have been learning is there is this disengagement between the digital space and Indigenous communities. Commonly and frequently, especially in academia, always we want to put Indigenous communities in this checkbox or in this box of 500 years ago, 300 years ago, and they need to remain there. But actually, working with a lot of community members and a lot of Indigenous youth, what we have discovered is digital spaces are becoming a process of healing, a process of actually engaging with community and reconnecting with culture. So the first thing that I need to say before going in more details is this talk is not to standardize all Indigenous communities. I'm not going to give you the step 1, step 2, step 3, how you are going to implement your projects in every single community. I think this is a very important part. This is that is your job, is how you engage at the local level. What I'm going to be sharing with you is some principles, how you can start that conversation, and things that you need to acknowledge when you are talking with Indigenous communities. This is not going to be a review of policies. You already have a lot of policies in place in your workplaces, and this is not going to be a review of those policies. The idea is, I just want to share a little bit of those principles and how to start this conversation. Okay, so who we are? Well, we are. I always like to say that we are a social startup, Indigenous social startup, but a lot of people are like, how come social startup and Indigenous, that doesn't match a little bit? And I think it's part of the conversations that we are having is how these worlds that have been disconnected for so long, how can be connected? So I can talk, honestly, I have been talking about this the last month for hours. I know that we are limited on time, but I can explain you briefly a little bit of the community process and why it has been really important to engage with community. So maybe some of you have heard about the Indigenous Friends app. This app started at York University in a community process. So the Indigenous community at York, we start a consultation process and working together as community to try to create safer, never safe, spaces for Indigenous youth in post-secondary education. So one of the big things that we discover, and probably if you have worked in any mobile app, is how you can create a space that the user feels safe. How do you create a user experience that actually is centered to the user, and actually when the user gets into the space, they feel safe. So one of the biggest challenges is when you are talking with Indigenous youth, there is a lot of things happening. Around them. So how you are gonna create safer spaces. So what we discovered is creating the mobile app was not enough. And that is one of the big problems. When we are talking about digital tech, the only thing that we want to focus is in the software. The product is finished, then that's the final product. We're done for business. What we discover here is actually trying to engage with more community members. We are trying to redefine what we call the digital divide. Because that word or that concept of the digital divide is really problematic, because it's very paternalistic. We are gonna provide access to technology. This is a very, and especially for international NGOs and a lot of government agencies, they like to provide access, but what about if you provide control and ownership? That changes the tables in a different way. And I think Jonathan previously already mentioned it. When you provide ownership, control, access, possession to the communities, that changes the work around. And you're going to tell me, if you are a developer or even if you are in a managerial position, well, that entails a lot of resources, yes. That entails a lot of processes, yes. And so what we try to do in that process to engage with communities is how indigenous youth, they are not just going to be the users, but they are going to be also the creators, the developers, the designers. How we're going to engage. So we were a little bit naive, so we started looking around in Toronto to try to hire indigenous youth that were engaged in technology. Guess what? We didn't find a lot. We found very few people that indigenous youth that were engaged in, especially in coding. It's a real challenge. So then we started from that perspective, and especially 3 years ago, we realized, well, indigenous youth are not getting into STEM, and they are not getting into any tech work. Why? Why is this happening? Why if there are a lot of employment opportunities, people are not being engaged? And actually, it was mentioned by one speaker before. We are offering a lot of employment opportunities, but what about employability? So I think this is a very important aspect, is how we are training indigenous youth to get into the digital space. So what we decided is to create an entire program. It's a 3 weeks program for indigenous youth. The first thing that we do is to switch off the computers and the mobiles. The first thing to work with community is, let's start from the beginning. Let's start connecting with our culture. Let's start connecting with elders, with your history. So we are going to understand first. We are going to start that process of healing, and then we jump to the digital. The problem is, when we are talking about a lot of tech skills, we always want to engage immediately with a computer. And I have seen that a lot here in Canada, in many other countries. When we are engaging with the technical skills, the first thing is switch on your computer. We are going to start learning Microsoft Word, because that's very common in indigenous communities. However, what about the healing process that the indigenous youth are eager to have in those spaces? So what we realized, and I don't want to extend more, but in the digital program, what we discover is we need to create the safer spaces, not just in the digital world or the online world, also in the offline world. So before we start engaging in an educational program, teaching tech, we need to create that safer space. So we have a lot of sharing circles. We have a lot of elders, local elders, coming from community to teach the youth. And just giving you a little bit of feedback, as some elders in Saskatchewan were saying, we always saw technology as our enemy, because that was pulling out a lot of our community members from our culture. But now we are changing our perspective, because now we can see that it actually can be a tool to reconnect and a way to continue this conversation. And this year, what we are creating is, and especially in this startup business and a startup environment, a suite. A suite is, we discovered that there is a lot of digital skills training out there, But what we discover is indigenous youth they need a special training before they can get into a certification program, before they can get into a very technical, tech-oriented program, because there is a lot of necessities in the community. So what we are trying to do is create supported internships for the youth so they can get employment. So what we are trying to lead is we are just going to be a facilitator of the process. So we are going to walk alongside the indigenous youth in order for the person to succeed in the industry. So anyway, this has been a little bit of our path. So now, from all these experiences, a lot of communities that we have served online and offline, what do we have discovered? First of all, and this I need to recognize, this is not my knowledge, and this is very important, and this is a part of the OCA principles. This is the medicine wheel. This is the Anishinaabe medicine wheel. So this is from this territory, from the territory of Toronto, and a lot of elders from this territory shared this knowledge with me. Elder Blue Waters, Amy Deyer-Lee, Billy Allen. So this knowledge is not mine. The only thing that we did as community is how we can engage this knowledge that has been here for millennia with the tech. And this is when we discover a lot of similarities. And what we discover is this conversation has happened for a long period of time. The problem is, again, no one is listening. So in the teachings of the medicine wheel, we always start in the east, facing east in the spiritual dimension. So I'm going to start with the first one, that is infrastructure, because that spiritual part is, if you don't have that, you cannot be alive. So what is the first thing that we need in tech? Infrastructure. And in infrastructure, what I'm referring as the colonial infrastructure is, the first part is about the hardware. We always talk about data, but what about the hardware? So of course, hardware is expensive. They require a lot of people maintaining the hardware. They require high technical skills. But in the vision of a decolonial infrastructure is when communities own the hardware. So not to leave you just with that abstract knowledge, I want to give you one example. In a lot of Latin American countries, what a lot of indigenous communities are deciding is to own their own telecommunications companies. So the telecommunications are owned by the community. So all the infrastructure, not just the software, the entire antennas, all the devices are owned by communities. So the idea is how we can get to that stage that actually communities own the hardware. The second part, the software. And I think this is very important to mention. And maybe for you maybe for some of you, this is going to be a little bit obvious. But right now, a lot of indigenous youth are being engaged with technology because mobiles. Why mobiles? Because indigenous communities around the world, and especially in Canada, they are always moving. Mobility. They cannot stay in the same place for a long period of time because they have a lot of barriers. So mobiles are actually a really good way to engage with the indigenous youth. And not just with the youth, with a lot of community members that are always moving. Also, now with all the capabilities in media, they are responding to a lot of the orality that are in the community. So all these aspects are important in the moment of creating infrastructure in indigenous communities. I know that from a security point of view, that triggers, of course, you need to invest more resources in security. You need to invest a little more of course, in mobile development. And but that is the way that indigenous communities are being engaged in digital technology. What happens commonly is I have seen a lot of projects that they go to the communities and they create this labs or digital labs with computers that they don't move. Commonly, it's not in all cases, but commonly those labs are still being used after a couple of years. Why? Because they are not allowing the community to continue their journey. And finally, the third aspect of infrastructure is community itself. And this is very important, and this is a little bit stretching a little bit of the limits, is the community needs to be part of that infrastructure. What does that mean? when you are talking about stakeholders, you need to bring the community, you need to bring the elders, you need to bring the knowledge keepers, you need to bring even the kids. You need to bring all that community as part of the infrastructure. And when you don't include the community, when you are just talking about hardware and software, you are not going to be able to engage the community. And commonly what happens when you don't take the community as part of the infrastructure is someone from outside controlling the technology within the community. What happens, the community doesn't take care of any hardware, of software. They are not engaged at all, and commonly they are not using it at all. Let's go to the South. The South is the digital software bundle. And this is a little anyone here is a coder? Do we have coders? Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay, we have several coders. So I have a computer science background, and one of the things that I learned when I was learning coding was that we need to follow standards. And you need to follow this very structural way of thinking. And if you are out of there, you are not coding. Or your coding can be problematic for a lot of people. So what we decided to do is actually to bring traditional knowledge. And this was a journey of almost 2 years of talking to elders. So our first process with the elders was very funny, because when we started talking to the elders, they were not engaged at all. And every time that I was talking about back-end, front-end, databases, data, they were like, okay, that sounds good, yes, okay. So it was very difficult actually to engage all the community members into a conversation. However, what we decided is, I think we need to rethink how we are designing software. How software engineering is way behind on a lot of the community matters of, this was intense. A lot of the community matters that are happening at the community level. So what we decided is, we engage in a lot of the teachings for raising a TP. TP is more from the peoples from the West, especially from the prairies in Canada. However, a lot of peoples, and especially Ojibwe people, have learned about the teachings of the TP. So what we realized is, bringing the teachings of the TP, what we decided is to create this TP ceremony as a software framework. So what we decided is to follow the protocols of raising a TP to create the software. For a lot of people, was like, of course, I have a lot of friends that are developers, and they were like, what are you doing? Stop doing what you're doing. This is not what we learned in school. This is not a standardized way of doing things. But this is part of the problem. We are not challenging those ways of creating software. So, and I have heard a lot of that word today, and I think this is part also of the conversation, agile. So how we are taking the framework of agile and actually taking also the teachings of the TP in order to create a decolonial software framework. It has been great, because now when we go to the elders, we say, actually we need to raise another poll. That means another feature needs to go into the app. It's another way. And what we are trying to implement with this is, when you enter a TP, you need to follow the protocols of the TP. You need to follow the rules. And what you say inside the TP cannot go outside. That's part of the TP protocols. So when you get into this digital TP, the idea is you need to respect the protocols. You need to respect the privacy. You need to respect what is being said. And also, I can talk for, as I said, for the entire day about this framework. But another important part is, always in tech, we have the users, the admins, and the developers, right? So we have those privileges when we are creating all the infrastructure. So what we decided is, those roles in indigenous communities, and especially in First Nations, they don't match a lot of the dynamics of the communities. What we have inside this space, we have clans. Each of the clans has responsibilities. Each of the clans has something to do within the app. So right now we have seven different clans, but actually we realized last month that we require another 3. So we are always trying to get the feedback from the community and trying to gather all these pieces of information and creating the digital software bundle. Okay, because I know that we are limited on time, I'm gonna pass to the next one. Decolonial Cyberspace. A lot of things have been happening in the cyberspace in the last month, in the last 2 months. Probably you have heard about Wet'suwet'en. Wet'suwet'en, this, I know that I see a little bit of faces like, ugh. But as you know, there is a lot of tensions between the federal government and the traditional chiefs and the hereditary chiefs in British Columbia. But why I'm bringing that conversation in? Because this is a decolonial cyberspace. All the movements were organized in Facebook, not in other platforms, in Facebook. A lot of things are happening in this cyberspace. So when we question is, we know all the threats, all the privacy issues that are on Facebook, and a lot of things that are happening in Facebook, especially after the scandal with, I forgot the name. I will remember in a moment. But all the scandals around Facebook, so why indigenous communities are being engaged in Facebook is because a lot of things that Facebook is providing is a lot of what we require in that cyberspace. If you want your application or your website to be used by indigenous communities, is how you are implementing the presence, how you are indigenizing the space in a way that is easy to understand for an indigenous perspective, how you are allowing people to care about each other. Something that we realize in Facebook is people are using Facebook for journaling. Every day they are journaling on Facebook and they are trying to take care of each other. So if they have a bad day, they are gonna put that the status and people are gonna comment, how do you feel? What do you need? I'm gonna call you tomorrow. So that caring, how we are providing that caring. Sharing. A lot of the youth are facing a lot of issues. So one important part is how you are sharing that information. And of course, orality. So indigenous peoples are oral. So how we are allowing these spaces actually to share that orality and how they can start continuing those conversations even when they are not in their territories. So I always like to say that the acknowledgement of land shouldn't be just in the offline world, but also on the online world. And this is very important, and this is recognizing that many of these devices, a lot of the parts of these devices are coming from the land. And a lot of indigenous communities from other sides of the world are being exploited in order to extract these resources. So it's very important to continue that conversation also online. And this is, in this case, is Facebook, the one that is succeeding in these conversations. Okay, and I think Jonathan already talked a lot about this. I just want to add a little bit of, in that conversation, what it entails, the indigenous data sovereignty. I think one of the biggest challenges, and I think this is a very good analogy. Before, when we are talking about colonization, we always talk in an indigenous, with indigenous communities. So indigenous communities are facing a lot of colonization. But the problem now is that colonization, and especially in the online world, is happening to everyone, not just to indigenous communities. Now our data is being shared everywhere. Now that data, that extractivism that we talked a long time ago with indigenous community, that extractivism is happening every single time that you are connecting to a mobile phone. So that extractivism is also happening to you. So this is when indigenous communities are saying, hey, remember us? Remember our struggles? Well, we have been facing this for a long period of time. And now everyone is part of that data extractivism. I heard in another panels about libraries, archives, galleries, and museums. These are spaces that are trying to implement a lot of the principles of indigenous data sovereignty. However, I need to say something, and I already said it in Creative Commons, and people almost slapped me on the face. But all these institutions have been the mining companies for a lot of indigenous communities. They have been extracting knowledge from indigenous communities, not just in Canada, everywhere, and putting that in the archives, in the libraries, in the books, in all this. And so this data extractivism, can continue, and especially with digital spaces. What are the challenges of and especially from especially if we have data analysts, if we have experts in data, what is one of the biggest problems with data and indigenous data? The problem is the only way to legally work with data and commonly is around intellectual property. Intellectual property and how we protect the data. The problem is intellectual property doesn't match traditional knowledge. And so a lot of communities have said, well, in my community, there is not that understanding of ownership, individual ownership. We have a collective, and it was mentioned by Jonathan, that collective ownership. So how in the world of intellectual property, how that can be translated. So there are a lot of different challenges. Of course, the OCAP principles in the case of First Nations in Canada is a good example. The big challenge is now, and I think is continue that conversation, is the data is not just being shared within Canada. Remember, the internet is global. So how those conversations are going to be implemented in other latitudes, right? So I think that has been a little bit of the challenges. And also, on that side, doctrinal gaps. I can, as I said, explain this for 2 hours, but I think one of the biggest challenges of traditional knowledge is that it's not something fixed. It's not something that you can put with a limited square and say, this is exactly what I'm referring with traditional knowledge. The problem is, even a song, a piece of art is always changing. So especially if it is for example, the medicine wheel. The medicine wheel, it has been for millennia, and the teachings have evolved in all these years. So in order to protect the data, it becomes really, really difficult because traditional knowledge is not that fixed. And again, going back to what I mentioned before, the medicine wheel that is owned by the teachings that I shared with you that are from the Ojibwe people of this territory, who in the legal system, who are the Ojibwe people? So it becomes a little bit more challenging, and especially in international arena, bringing this indigenous data sovereignty. Anyway, I think what I want to with you today is I want you to just bring, and especially if you are trying to work with indigenous communities, is bringing these conversations. So how you are engaging indigenous peoples in the conversations of infrastructure, that they can own the hardware, that they can own the software, and also how you are engaging with the community. The software, how you are trying to actually bundle that traditional knowledge with coding, and a way that the knowledge can be more accessible for the community. A space, how to create safer spaces online and offline. And data, how we are protecting the data of all these nations and communities. So for this, going back to your devices, okay, so if you go to the tab, there is one, the first tab says ideas. Let me show you this tab. Ideas. So you can see this question. So after all this talking, and now I mentioned at the beginning, I want a two-way conversation, but it's a little bit challenging with all these groups. So my question is, how you will engage indigenous peoples in digital projects within your organization? So please take the time, even if you just answer something quick. The idea, remember you didn't put your name, so you don't need to worry about it. Just be respectful. But I would like to hear from you. Already one person answered about what are your ideas. promise I'm not going to be pointing people who mentioned this, oh, who you are. I promise I'm not going to do it. This is just a way, because my understanding always when I'm in these type of spaces is I can talk a lot and I can explain a lot of things, but when you try to put down that into your organization, that becomes a challenge. And when I was listening to all the different levels and layers of bureaucracy that you have within the government to deploy any projects, I can see a lot of issues here, right? But I would like to hear from you a little bit. I know that probably there are Q&As. Oh, no? Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, I can do it even bigger. Yeah, no problem. So, also, what I decided to do, let me tell you that Luke told me that actually we were going to be more people. That's why I really wanted to use this as an exercise. If you have also Q&As, actually you can put your Q&As in the system. So actually you can see what other people are asking. So I think that this is going to be a good way to see if people have the same interests or common interests. Okay, so we have 15. Okay. So, oh, sorry about that. Oh. Yeah. Okay. Oh, sorry about that. Yeah. So, okay, so some ideas. Attribute every idea. That is part of the OK principles. Understand their needs, but start with others who have already done some work. And I think we always mention this in the non-for-profit sector, how we can start connecting ourselves in different ways. Start with understanding the effects of colonization within the community and then work towards reconciliation in the digital space. Reconciliation has become an interesting word within a lot of communities, but I understand the meaning of this sentence. I think it's important that how the conversations that we are having in these spaces, that commonly not a lot of Indigenous peeps are here, how we are bringing those peeps into the conversation. Research what Indigenous peoples have already said and ask new Indigenous peoples. I think, and this is a very good, thank you for that comment. I think this is really important because Indigenous peoples have been engaging with technology since millennia, just not the type of technology that we envision as digital technology, as the things that we are using in the Western society. The type of technologies that Indigenous peoples have been used are different, and of course they have they have other ways to approach. Ask people who have already asked how would the Indigenous community like to be engaged. Okay, scare that white colonial savior mentality. Okay, this is a good point. The savior mentality. I think one important aspect is commonly when there is a lot of work with communities, I have seen this approach, not just in the digital tech. This is overall in any project with communities. That idea of we need to save them, we need to do something for them. It's this idea of paternalistic point of view. I think that savior mentality we need to get over that, and I think is how the communities, they want to start creating their own solutions. And I promise you, if you engage with the community, they are going to engage with your technology. They are going to embrace it. They are going to use it because they have been considered for that. Anyway, maybe I'm not going to start by hiring. Oh, that's a good one, actually. Okay, let's do a quick poll. In your screens, a new question is coming in. Let's see. Okay. We have 3, the average, 2.9, 17 responses. Yeah, almost 3. Oh, going down, going down, going down, going down. Okay. Yeah. So, yes, around 2 people. So imagine, so if we are trying to implement all this in a, we have a big number there. So if we are trying to engage our communities and trying to implement all these principles, if we are not, of course, hiring, and there is something very, very tricky about this, and I have seen a lot of social startups that have started to doing this. They hire the indigenous person as the token. Okay, because we need to decolonize the space, we are going to hire just the person in a low position, and well, basically that's decolonizing for a lot of organizations. But I think this is a challenge. How we are going to be engaging those people into the conversations of creating technology in a design perspective, in a decision-making perspective. I think that is really important. Okay. Thank you for your answers. Just to show you this one. So 69%, have you ever engaged with indigenous peoples and digital projects? Let me tell you, these have changed in the last 5 years. This was almost 100% no 5 years ago. Now there is a lot of more things going on. And I think it's really important that indigenous peoples continue to engage. Okay, so just before we start with the Q&A, because I think this is going to allow a lot of the conversations to happen, I put you a last question. A last question on your side. What are the challenges? Lack of education. Okay. What else? Let's see what people are saying. Education. Don't copy. Don't copy. Community. Good. Work. This is nice. Work. Okay, this is moving. Decolonization. I like that word. Ignorance. Wow. Okay. Lack, ignorance. Okay. So this is interesting to see, and I really like the collective knowledge, because this is reflecting a lot of the needs that all of you are having in order to implement all of this. So there is a lot of, let's say, lackness of a lot of things. Ignorance, work, decolonization, connection. This is great. Not a word. Okay. Thank you, everyone. You can continue answer. Just for the sake of the time, I'm gonna jump to the Q&A. Let's see what we have here. 5 votes. Okay. Why did you choose 3 weeks for your program, and how did you achieve so many learning objectives in such a short time? Oh, that's a very good one. I think the biggest challenge about the timing is about how the big challenge with indigenous youth, as I said, is they are always moving. They are always trying to go to a different place to get employment. They need to go back to, in many cases, we went to during the summer. So it was more about the dynamic of the youth. And I know that it's challenging because it's a very short period of time. And especially in a lot of settings, we were like from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. So it was a long period of time. But I think the biggest constraint of the time was to listen to a little bit of the communities and how the dynamic is in the communities. And learning objectives. The learning objectives, and this is, I think it's important to say, is many of the times, for example, especially with coding, You are not going to teach anyone to code in 3 weeks. Of course not. But what we are trying to do is just to ignite the knowledge, to start especially that curiosity in the youth. So what we discover is, of course, we are trying to engage in a very simple task and very simple programs. And there are several youth that they tell you right away, that sounds phenomenal, but I don't like coding. I don't like it. I like more, we have a very heavy component in digital art. And what they do, they just started doing amazing artistic pieces. So what we are basically, and going back to the question, what we are trying to do is trying to, in those 3-4 weeks, is to try to just a starting point of all those digital topics, and from there continue the process. Actually, the idea is in the online platform is we can continue the process with the ones that want to continue the process. It's challenging. It's challenging, and sometimes a lot of the. For example, let me put you an exact example. In Regina, we put a heavy coding curriculum. But what happened when we were there, when we were with the youth, and when they were giving us feedback, is they said, to be honest, like we really need more digital arts. They were really eagering for digital arts, and they were eagering more for cultural teachings. So at the end of the day, we need to pack the coding in just 2 days, and basically focus in everything else. So it's part of that listening story. I don't know if that answered a little bit the question. You can, if I didn't answer properly, you can put another one. Are there indigenous telecoms in Canada? Yes, of course. Keynote. These are amazing people. So basically, several First Nations community in the north part of Ontario, they own the infrastructure of Keynote, and they provide a lot of telecommunications in several communities. The interesting part is they have been working with big telecommunications companies in order to connect the people from those communities to other services. And I think one very interesting part to learn from Keynote, and I think this is a dynamic also to understand a lot of the indigenous issues that are happening. Keynote comes from the band council, and that comes from the elected chiefs. However, and especially with Wet'suwet'en, now it's a little, I think, more open knowledge that commonly those elected chiefs don't reflect exactly what the community wants. So I think one of the interesting parts is to see how Keynote in the last years, they have been engaging more with the community, not just with the elected officials, so they can have a little bit more of the feedback. Yes, so I don't know how we are doing in time. Do we have, 5 minutes? Okay, so let's go. Okay, so in digital programming with Indigenous youth, I have been involved with it. Retention has been a significant issue. How can we provide the most value to youth upfront so they stay engaged? Excellent question. I love this question. I think one common mistake and this is not just applicable for digital projects, for any educational program. I also teach in university, so sometimes this is not just for indigenous communities. This happens to everyone. So you really put a lot of effort, a lot of time, a lot of resources in order. Even you provide the tools, you provide the computer, you provide the software, you provide everything, and then how they are going to continue being engaged. I think one important aspect, and I think this has been very successful, is we allow them to create their own projects. So part of the program is to imagine what they can create. So there have been several examples where, for example, in Sakmok and Anishinaabe First Nation, they decided to create a drone, but like a canoe. So it was a canoe with the four parts of the drone and trying to fly up. So those exercises are very useful because then the youth, they are starting envisioning what they want. Many of them, they want to blog. Many of them, they want to continue their artistic pieces. So one of the biggest questions that they always say is, is this worthy? Is this piece of digital art worthy? And then when you provide the platforms, actually they continue to be engaged because actually they see a connection between their culture and the digital. And I think that is really important. I have seen several programs by many other organizations that they don't have this component, and I would say that this is very common, that you basically leave the space and the youth stops engaging with the technology. Okay, how do you get the word out to the community about the app? I think basically word of mouth. A lot of community members. So initially, the app was going to go just for post-secondary students. But what happened is, and this is part of the user experience and user-centered design, is a lot of community members, they were like, I have a lot of brothers, sisters that they didn't have the opportunity to go to college or university, and they want to go into the app. Are you going to deny an access to them? So actually, it was actually a big discussion with a lot of people. No, we need to go back and we need to redesign how we are going to be engaging with all these people that want to get into. Okay, I think we are done with time. Okay, so I think I'm just going to have my last minute of words. I think it's really important, especially here in Toronto, is how we are engaging indigenous communities and this big tech hub that is happening all the time. So it's really frequently that I see a lot of digital events happening on one side, and there is a lot of indigenous events happening on the other side, but they don't interact. There is not that communication. And I'm sorry if I'm gonna say something a little bit stressful for a lot of people, but it's not enough just bringing smudging at the beginning of the events. You really need to engage indigenous peoples into the conversations. They really need to engage in a meaningful way. If it is just about smudging, don't do it. So really, really try to engage, and thank you so much.